Good morning, everyone, or afternoon if you are back on the East Coast. This is Joyelle here from Parenting with PTSD. And today I'm going to talk to you about the resilience documentary and some of the mental health myths that I feel this important information debunks in the best possible way. So I watched the resilience documentary yesterday for the first time. They had a virtual screening, and I'm sure I was one of thousands who logged on and watched the film yesterday. I have been waiting for months for this opportunity to see the film. And if you have seen the documentary, you know that this is an incredibly powerful piece of work, and it's sharing some really important information with the world that really needs to get out there. So if you haven't seen the film, just a rough outline of what resilience is about. Resilience is about the work that's currently being done that has evolved from the ACEs, or Adverse Childhood Experiences study, which showed that childhood trauma has long-term implications for your health, mental health, and even for your lifespan. For those who had a score of 6 or more, it could shorten your lifespan by up to 20 years. And there have been a lot of implications that have come as a result of this research, and there are some people doing amazing work in the world with this information, creating trauma-informed schools and communities. And this documentary featured a lot of those people who are doing incredible work in this field. So today we're going to talk about the top 4 damaging mental health myths that we live with culturally and how the science of ACEs debunks those myths. I think these are really important to address because these kind of myths really are so damaging because they're not addressed. We kind of live with them in the background, and any thoughts that we have on that kind of unconscious level are impacting us in ways that we don't even realize. So myth number 1, time heals all wounds. And I don't know if you've heard this one. I certainly have. And it's this idea that somehow with enough time passing after a traumatic event, will get better. And the science of adverse childhood experiences tells us, quite frankly, that that just isn't true. And especially when we have experienced what's called toxic stress as a child. And toxic stress means any overwhelming traumatic experience that happens without the buffer of a safe, caring, responsive adult to help the child through it. So any experience of toxic stress can literally change the shape of our developing brains. It changes the connections that are made. Some connections are made, some connections are not made. So when we say this idea that time heals all wounds, well, of course it doesn't, because this impact at this early age when our brains are developing shapes us. And so it's not something that we can just say, well, with enough time, you'll be over it. Of course you won't, because this has, much like a tree that is growing on the coast where I live on the coast of west coast of Canada. And you see all these trees on the coast that are constantly buffeted by the winds. And the trees kind of grow up in these crazy, crazy shapes along the coastline in response to those winds. And our brains are like that with toxic stress. It changes the shape of them. So that was myth number 1. Time heals all wounds. We know now that it doesn't. So we can't just pretend that enough time passing will make everything okay. And I apologize if you hear the noise in the background. It's garbage day today and the garbage trucks are driving by. So I'm really sorry if the noise is going to be loud in a minute. So myth number 2, which I think is a really important one as well to address, is it's all in your head. And I know as a child, I can remember having these physical sensations arise and being told by parents or doctors, well, you know, it's all in your head. And what we understand now about trauma is that the body remembers trauma, and that we can't separate out the brain and the body as if they are two completely separate mechanisms, and that if we can just think things away with our brains, then it won't impact us on either a mental health or physical health level. What ACEs science teaches us is that early trauma can increase your risk of heart disease and cancer, and you can't think those things away. This is lodged inside your body. And this is a really important point to address when we're looking at how do we work on negating these impacts. Obviously, it's not a matter of let's just think some happy thoughts and everything will be better, because it won't. Myth number 3, if you just stopped XYZ behavior, whatever your overindulgence is, if you just stopped drinking too much or eating too much, or my favorite addiction, working too much, if you just stopped those addictive behaviors, then everything would be fine. It's not true. We know that for trauma survivors, when we take a look from a trauma-informed, strengths-based approach, trauma survivors are using alcohol, drugs, workaholism, food addictions, whatever it is. We are using these things because they helped us survive. And yes, there is a certain point in our life when obviously they have become not a helpful tool. However, these are the things that people use in order to survive situations that are so incredibly traumatic and overwhelming that without those tools, they wouldn't know how to get through. Because at an early age, we have become disembodied. It has become too hard to live in our bodies. And so we choose a method that works for us to not be inside of our own skins because it hurts too much to feel. We weren't allowed to feel. So when we're talking about trauma survivors, this is a really important myth to debunk. You can't just tell somebody, if you just stopped drinking, then everything would be better. We need to put tools in place and give them tools to help learn a little bit at a time to start feeling the feelings that have been suppressed for a really, really long time. We need to give them tools to learn how to be inside their bodies, looking at the success of some great somatic therapies like EMDR and other therapies that address the body. Teaching someone slowly how to re-enter and how to feel those feelings again is very important. And the last myth, and I think one of the really important ones that needs to be addressed about mental health, is those problems only happen in poor or ethnic communities. I hate that word, but this is something that comes from a white upper class lens, and we have to address the racist and classist bias that exists in our understandings of mental health. What's really great about the ACEs science is that the Adverse Childhood Experiences study that was originally done in 1998 was done in a mostly white, mostly middle and upper class population of over 17,000 people. And adverse childhood experiences exist in those communities. Adverse childhood experiences such as sexual assault, childhood sexual assault, abuse, neglect, abandonment, living with a mentally ill family member, having an imprisoned family member, having parents who are divorced or separated. These things exist across all communities. And we can't say that, oh, it doesn't happen in my community. We know from all of the research that's been done since then, because there have been multiple adverse childhood experiences studies done in multiple communities since then, that these issues of children experiencing traumatic, toxic stress childhoods, this happens everywhere. And so we can't be saying, well, we're only going to look at this one community and see, because they're the ones who need the help, but we're fine in our community. No, we're not. None of us are fine. None of us are okay. which brings me to one of the points in the film that I really loved, which was that there was a group of people who were at a conference talking about, what do you do with this information? And one of the people said, well, you know, what we need is like a public health campaign along the level of the campaigns that were done to encourage people to understand the dangers of secondhand smoke. This is the level of awareness that we need to achieve with helping people to understand that adverse childhood experiences are a public health concern. And this is something that needs to be spread in schools, in hospitals, in communities, in our social work, and most importantly, in families. This is an area that I would really love to see a lot of growth in. We need to be having conversations within families about mental health, about intergenerational trauma that has been passed down. And we need to normalize these conversations. And that's why I think this resilience documentary is so fantastic, because that's what this is built to do, is to normalize these conversations, to talk about how this is something that impacts us all. And what do we do with that information? How do we move forward knowing that the experiences that you had as a child are going to impact you for your entire lifetime and possibly shorten your lifespan? How do we take this information out into the world? I think it's one person at a time. We share our stories, whether it's in a public forum, like we do at Parenting with PTSD, where we share stories of parents who are survivors of childhood trauma, or whether it's a private forum at home at your dinner table, talking about understanding the brain science. And I've been talking about this with my own kids now, which is really exciting. My kids are 5 and 10 now. And especially with the 10-year-old, I have been sharing with him when I'm learning something new, and I'm saying, isn't this interesting how the experiences that you have when they're a young child actually change which connections are made in your brain, and it changes the shape of your brain? Isn't it interesting how when the amygdala is engaged, how it shuts down your thinking and memory centers, and also makes it even literally harder for you to hear because of the way it impacts your middle ear. And so if you're trying to communicate with somebody who is feeling upset or angry, their amygdala is making it harder for you to communicate with them. The more we talk to our families and our communities about brain science and about how we understand these impacts on our brains of early trauma, and not just early trauma, but how our brains work when we are feeling these overwhelming feelings throughout life, even without a trauma history. Just understanding these simple pieces of information can help us communicate with each other better, can help us self-regulate better, help us co-regulate better with our children. So, in summary, I just wanted to say thank you to the makers of the Resilience documentary. I live on the west coast of Canada, just outside of Vancouver. I'm really hoping that there's going to be a screening here sometime in the near future. The closest one I know of is in Seattle on May the 2nd. It's going to be produced, I think it's called Sound Discipline, and I will put the link in the notes here for you in case there's anybody who wants to go see that filming. This is Joyelle with Parenting with PTSD. We are here to keep a conversation going about the long-term impacts of childhood trauma and how we can break the cycle of abuse for our families. Thanks for being here today. I hope this was some helpful information. And please leave comments in the comment box. If you have any questions, I'll be around for a few minutes to answer questions. And or if you have any comments or thoughts, or if there's anything that was confusing or you'd like to know a little bit more about. All right. Have a beautiful day and take good care of yourself.